Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. There are secrets buried in the Appalachian Mountains that defy all logic, shadows that stretch across generations, and a man whose mask of devotion hid something far more sinister. Comment on where you're watching from, because this narrative will take you to places where faith became a weapon and trust a sentence. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. In the autumn of 1908, the isolated communities of West Virginia lived under a rigid code of tradition and religiosity. Baptist and Methodist churches dominated every valley, every clearing among the mist-shrouded peaks. It was common for itinerant preachers to traverse the steep trails, offering sermons in exchange for shelter and food. These men were received as divine messengers, and few families dared question their credentials or intentions. Trust was absolute, hospitality sacred. It was in this setting that a man began to circulate through the remote villages of Pocahontas County. He presented himself as a reverend, carried a worn Bible, and spoke with the eloquence of someone who knew every verse by heart. His appearance was ordinary: medium height, dark hair combed back, light eyes that seemed too sincere. He always wore a worn but clean black suit and carried a leather briefcase that, according to him, contained only his scriptures and a few personal belongings. No one ever saw what was really inside. The first impressions were always the same. He would arrive at dusk, knocking on the doors of the most remote houses, asking permission to lead a prayer in exchange for a place to sleep. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic. He knew exactly what to say to touch the hearts of weary families, lonely widows, men who worked themselves to exhaustion in the coal mines. He spoke of redemption, of the nearness of the end times, of the need to purify the soul before it was too late, and people listened. They believed. What no one noticed was the pattern. He never stayed more than 3 nights in the same place. He always left before dawn, and there was a strange feeling in the air, as if something had gone with him. At first, it was little things, like a family heirloom that went missing, or an envelope with savings hidden under the mattress. There was nothing that made a formal complaint necessary, nothing that would hurt the reputation of a man of God. But then people started to leave. People who had gotten him just disappeared weeks later. There was no body and no sign of a fight. It was like they had been wiped off the face of the earth. The neighbors talked in whispers, but no one put the pieces together. There were a lot of disappearances in that area, after all. The mountains were dangerous, the winters were cold, and things went wrong. Or at least, that's what everyone wanted to think. The Reverend kept going south, crossing whole counties without leaving any official evidence of his presence. He knew how to stay away from the bigger cities where sheriffs might ask him questions that were hard to answer. He liked the forgotten villages, the ones that weren't even on maps. In those places, the church elders were the only ones in charge, and a preacher's word was more important than any written law. And as he went on, something darker started to take shape. People whispered stories in bars, and travelers who swore they had seen this reverend in places where strange crimes had happened. But nothing was certain. There was no thorough investigation. Because who would think a man who quoted the Bible with such conviction? The thick fog that covered the Appalachian valleys at that time of year made the place feel strange and almost unreal. The trees lost their leaves, leaving bare branches that looked like twisted fingers pointing up at the gray sky. People looked over their shoulders even in the middle of the day because of the way the land looked. And it was in this place that the first whispers began to form, turning into something that couldn't be ignored. Martha, a woman from Greenbrier County, had welcomed the Reverend to her private property. She had been a widow for 2 years and lived alone in a log cabin by a creek that ran through the woods. People knew Martha for her kindness and strong faith. She didn't think twice about letting the preacher in when he knocked on her door on a cold November afternoon. He stayed for 3 days, leading prayers at dawn and dusk and talking about how important it is to give to others and not be attached to things. The next morning, the neighbors who lived almost 3 kilometers away noticed that smoke wasn't coming out of Martha's chimney. It was strange because she always started the fire before the sun came up. They found the house empty when they finally went to look. The door was open. Martha was gone, but her things were still there. She also didn't have the only piece of jewelry she owned, a silver brooch that had belonged to her mother. The sheriff in the area said it could have been an accident. She might have gotten lost in the woods. Maybe she fell into the creek and was carried away by the current. There were no signs of violence or proof that anything bad had happened. The Reverend was already far away, on his way to the next county and the next family that would welcome him with open arms. But Martha wasn't the only one. A pattern started to show up in the shadows over the next few months. A lonely farmer from Monroe County went missing in January 1909, just days after hosting a traveling preacher. An old woman who lived on the edge of a village called Union was next in line in March. The Reverend would come, stay for a few days, leave before dawn, and then the person would just disappear, as if they had never been there. The fact that there was no evidence at all made it even more disturbing. There was no blood, no sign of a fight, and no clue as to where these people had gone. It was like the air had eaten them, and the Reverend kept going on his journey, always kind, always devout, and always carrying that leather briefcase that no one ever saw open. When local newspapers talked about the disappearances, they only talked about one case at a time. No one was putting the pieces together. No one noticed the pattern that went for hundreds of kilometers across the mountains. After all, West Virginia was very big. There wasn't much communication between counties, and each sheriff only had power over his own area. It was almost impossible to find out who committed a crime that crossed administrative lines. And there was one more thing that kept the Reverend safe: human nature itself. People didn't want to believe that a man of faith could do something so bad. It was easier to believe in natural causes like accidents or coincidences. They could either admit that they had let evil into their homes and prayed next to someone whose intentions were as unclear as possible. He kept moving forward, always one step ahead of any suspicion. He was very careful with his technique. He picked his victims very carefully. People who were alone and didn't have any close family members who would look for them right away. And when he left, he took with him not only money and other valuables, but also the trust that people in those communities had in strangers. The month turned into a whole season, and the harsh winter in the Appalachians covered everything in snow. The roads became impassable. Investigations were put on hold, and the Reverend found safety in even more remote villages where his reputation had not yet reached. There, he was seen as a gift from God, someone who brought spiritual comfort during a time of loneliness and darkness. But spring was coming, and with it came something the Reverend hadn't expected. The memory of the whole community was starting to come back to life. People who traveled along trade routes between counties started to tell each other stories. One merchant talked about how Martha had gone missing. Another person talked about the Monroe farmer. A third person remembered the woman from Union. And then, little by little, the pieces started to fit together. There was a man who went to all of these places, an itinerant preacher who always followed the same pattern. He would come, stay for a few days, leave, and then someone would go missing. There was no way to ignore it anymore. Something had to be done. Not only did the mountains melt in the spring of 1909, but the Appalachian communities also woke up to something disturbing. People started talking differently in churches, makeshift markets, and small bars. They didn't just talk about the weather or the crops anymore. The Reverend was a name that came up a lot, and there was always a heavy silence that followed it. No one knew what his real name was. He never signed records, left papers, or stayed long enough for anyone to ask more questions. For some, he was Reverend Samuel. To some, Thomas the Reverend. In some places, he just called himself a brother in Christ without giving a name. This changeable nature of identity should have been the first warning sign, but people's blind faith made it hard to see the truth. Howard, a fabric merchant, went through 5 different counties on his usual routes and started to notice something strange. He heard the same stories at every stop. People always talked about the traveling preacher, and someone always went missing soon after he died. Howard wasn't very smart, but he had common sense. He started writing down dates and places in an old notebook that he kept in his wagon. When he finally got back to Pocahontas County, he looked for the sheriff, whose name was William Garrett. People knew this man was practical and didn't let superstitions get in the way of his work. Howard showed him his notes and told him about the pattern he had found. The sheriff looked at the records in silence, and his face got harder with each line he read. He knew 2 of the people who had gone missing personally. They were good people who worked hard and weren't the type to just leave everything behind without saying goodbye. Garrett started his own investigation by sending telegrams to sheriffs in nearby counties. It took a long time to talk. It took days for answers to come in, but slowly, a dark picture started to form. Over the course of 6 months, at least 8 other people had gone missing in the same way. All of them had met the Reverend, lived alone or in isolation, and then disappeared without a trace. The lack of any physical evidence was what bothered Garrett the most. He had gone to the empty houses and looked for signs of violence, such as signs of a fight, strange stains, or anything else that might have happened. Nothing. It was like the people had just decided to leave, but they left behind all their things except for a few valuables that were always missing: money, family jewels, and property deeds. In May of that year, Garrett learned that the Reverend had been seen near Nicholas County, heading south. He made the choice to do something. He got 2 deputies together and rode off on horseback with witness descriptions. A man of average height with dark hair, a black suit, and a leather briefcase. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The pursuit through the Appalachians turned out to be harder than they had thought. The paths were dangerous, the villages were far apart, and the pastor seemed to have a supernatural ability to stay hidden. Garrett would find out that the preacher had left the night before when he got to a place. When he finally got to the community where he was still living, the man had already gone into the woods before they could get to him. They finally saw him on a June afternoon, close to the Kentucky border. He was walking down a dirt road with his briefcase swinging next to him. His black suit was covered in dust from the trip. Garrett and his men rode up carefully, staying a safe distance away. The Reverend stopped when he realized someone was following him. He turned slowly, and for the first time, the witnesses could see his real face without the mask of devotion. There was no fear there. He didn't feel guilty. He was just cold and calculating, as if he were weighing his options. His clear eyes looked over the 3 men, taking in every detail and every move. Garrett got off the horse and kept his hand close to the gun in its holster. He said who he was and that they needed to talk about some people who had gone missing. The pastor smiled. It was a small smile, almost unnoticeable, but it had something in it that made Garrett's blood run cold. It was the smile of someone who knew what he had done and didn't feel bad about it at all. He didn't fight back. He just put the briefcase down and raised his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same soft voice that had fooled so many people. He said he didn't know what they were talking about, and that he was just a humble servant of God who had never hurt anyone. But his eyes told a different story. They showed a terrifying emptiness, a lack of humanity that words couldn't hide. Garrett told one of the deputies to get the briefcase. He felt the weight of it when he picked it up. It was way too heavy to just hold scriptures. The pastor didn't say anything, and he didn't ask for respect for his holy things. He just kept looking at Garrett with that cold smile, as if he knew that nothing they found really mattered. In a small, makeshift police station in the nearest village, which was a forgotten place called Richwood, the briefcase was opened. The wooden building was also a place for people to meet and store things. Garrett told everyone to leave, so there were only him and his 2 deputies left in the locked room. The Reverend stayed in a wooden chair with his hands cuffed, but his behavior was strange. He didn't seem nervous or desperate, like someone who was about to be found out. Instead, he seemed calm, as if he were watching everything from the outside and not really connected to it. The 3 men were speechless when the latches on the briefcase finally broke. There were no Bibles, written sermons, or religious songs. They found a carefully arranged collection of personal things like rings, brooches, silver chains, and small canvas pouches with coins in them. As if they were carefully kept trophies, each item was wrapped in fabric and kept apart from the others. There were also notebooks, a few of them with notes written in beautiful handwriting. Garrett grabbed one of the notebooks and started to flip through it. There were detailed records on the pages, including dates, county names, descriptions of houses, and information about the people who had received him. Everything was there, written down in a way that was very disturbing. The Reverend wrote a diary of what he did, not because he felt bad about it or needed to confess, but just because it was the right thing to do. It was like keeping track of business transactions or an inventory. Garrett noticed one of the notes. It was about Martha, the widow who lived in Greenbrier County. There was a description of where her property was, a mention of the silver brooch, and even comments about how much trust she had shown in letting him in. The last line of the entry was very upsetting. Departure before dawn, no problems. Next stop, Monroe. The deputies found the same kinds of entries for each of the missing people they looked into. The pattern was there, and the Reverend wrote it down himself. He not only knew what he was doing, but he was also recording everything, making a record of his own dark journey through the mountains. Garrett put his notebook away and looked at the man in front of him. He finally asked the question that everyone had wanted to ask from the beginning. Where are these people? The minister tilted his head a little, as if he were thinking about whether or not to answer. His voice still had that hypnotic quality, that tone that had fooled so many people when he finally spoke. The mountains have always kept secrets, Sheriff. They always will. It wasn't a direct admission, but it was enough. It was clear from the way he spoke and how easily he brought up the mountains that he knew exactly where those people were and had no plans to tell anyone. The next few days were spent trying to get more information. Garrett brought people who had seen the Reverend and family members of the missing victims as witnesses. Every fight was the same. The preacher listened quietly, smiled sometimes, but never said anything directly. He had based his defense on the fact that there was no physical evidence. No bodies, no crime scenes, and no proof of violence. There was nothing against him but coincidences and stolen things. A lawyer was hired to defend him. He was a young, idealistic man who thought everyone should have a fair defense. The lawyer talked to his client in private to try to figure out who he was. He asked him about his childhood, what made him a traveling preacher, and what he believed. The pastor only gave vague metaphors and Bible verses as answers. It was impossible to get past the surface and see what was really behind that mask. In the meantime, word of the arrest began to spread across the counties. Families of the missing people traveled for days to see the man who might have ruined their lives. They stood outside the police station, their faces showing how sad and confused they were. Some wanted justice right away. Some people just wanted to know what had happened to their loved ones. Garrett was aware that he had a problem. The proof he had was not direct. The notebooks showed that the Reverend had been to those people's houses and stolen their things, but they didn't directly show that he had caused the disappearances. A skilled prosecutor could say that he was just a thief who took advantage of the situation, and that the people who went missing did so for other reasons after he left. That was when Garrett made a dangerous choice. He set up search parties made up of volunteers who knew all the trails, valleys, and caves near where the victims had gone missing. They would have the proof they needed if they could find even one body. The job was huge. The Appalachians were huge, with deep ravines, fast-moving rivers, and thick forests where anyone could hide anything. The search went on for weeks. Volunteers had to deal with heavy rains, rough ground, and the fact that they were walking miles every day without finding anything. Some people started to lose hope. Maybe the minister was telling the truth in his own way. Maybe the mountains really did swallow those secrets for good. But at the end of July, something was found that changed everything. A group looking into a remote area close to where Martha went missing found something in a ravine that was covered by plants. There wasn't much, just bits and pieces that showed someone had been there. But it was enough to prove that what the Reverend said was not true. The people hadn't just gone. He knew something had happened to them, but he wouldn't say what it was. When the police got the news, Garrett went back to the cell where the Reverend was being held. This time, the preacher didn't smile. For the first time, a crack appeared in his mask of not caring. He knew the game had changed and that the net was closing in. Still, he didn't say anything, keeping the secrets he had as if they were worth more than his own freedom. In the summer, the Appalachians turned into a thick green mass, with the smell of wet earth and rotting plants mixing with the humid heat. The investigations went on in this stifling place, and every day they uncovered new layers of a mystery that seemed to have no end. Garrett was obsessed with the case. He spent whole nights going over the Reverend's notebooks, trying to figure out the hidden codes and patterns that could lead to more answers. The sheriff was most interested in the way the people who made those records thought. The Reverend's writing didn't sound like someone who was guilty or couldn't control their urges. His notes were cold, almost like he was writing down the results of scientific experiments. People noticed how the victim acted, like how they reacted to certain sermons and when they let their guard down completely. It was unsettling to see how much thought went into each action. One of the notebooks had something even more disturbing in it, a personal philosophy. The Reverend had written long paragraphs about what trust is, how blind faith makes people weak, and how easy it is to make and keep social masks. He thought of society as a big play where everyone had a part to play. He chose to be a preacher because it let him go into people's homes and gain their trust. There wasn't any real spirituality there, just harsh realism. At the same time, the trial was getting closer. Charles Henderson, the county prosecutor, was in charge of the case himself. Henderson was known for being tough in court, but even he said it was hard. The defense would say that they only had stolen goods and coincidences, with no direct proof or confession. The most they could get would be a theft conviction, which would mean a few years in prison. Henderson spent weeks talking to everyone who had met the Reverend. He had to make such a full picture that the jury would have no doubts about the defendant's character. He went to 5 different counties and talked to merchants, relatives of the victims, and people who had hosted the preacher but, by chance or luck, had not disappeared. One witness gave us a lot of useful information. Elizabeth was the name of the woman who lived in Webster County. Last winter, the Reverend stayed at her house for 2 nights. Elizabeth was a widow, but she didn't live alone like the other victims. Her sister lived with her, and the fact that they were always together may have saved her life. Elizabeth said that the preacher had asked her questions about her savings, her valuables, and her daily life in a roundabout way. She thought it was just normal curiosity at the time. She now knew that she was being judged. Henderson was most impressed by what Elizabeth said about how the Reverend acted during prayers. She said that while everyone else had their eyes closed in prayer, she had opened hers for a moment and saw him watching everyone around him with a disturbing intensity. His face showed no peace or calm that is common in someone who is spiritually connected. It was only cold calculation, as if he were looking at each person in the room and weighing their options. In August, news came in from other places. Sheriffs in Kentucky and Tennessee said they had similar cases of people going missing because of a traveling preacher. The descriptions were the same: a black suit, a leather briefcase, and a way of speaking that was hypnotic. The pattern covered a lot more ground than Garrett had thought it would. There weren't 8 people who were hurt. There could have been dozens of them spread out over 3 states and several years. This new information changed everything. The case was no longer just a local issue. It became something much bigger. Reporters from faraway cities started to show up because they were interested in the story of the fake reverend who had fooled whole communities. The articles that were published were all different. Some were sensationalist and some were moralizing. But they all agreed on one thing: that man had used what was most sacred to people, their faith, to do terrible things. The priest in his cell didn't seem to care that more and more people were paying attention. He spent his days reading the Bible he had asked for and writing notes in the margins. When people asked him what he was writing about, he would only say that he was getting ready for the final judgment. It was unclear if he meant the earthly court or something else. He was purposely vague in order to keep control of the story. Garrett went to the cell often, but not to question anyone. He just watched. He wanted to know how someone could live with themselves after what that man had done. And what bothered him the most was that the minister seemed to be at peace. There were no signs of inner pain, no visible nightmares, and no times when they seemed weak. It was like his mind had been turned off completely, or maybe it had never been there at all. Henderson got an anonymous letter in September, right before the trial. A person who only called themselves a concerned observer said they had seen the Reverend in similar circumstances years before in a nearby state. The letter talked about the same things: how he came as a preacher, how he was treated, and how he disappeared after that. Whoever wrote the letter had kept this information to themselves for years. They might have been afraid to get involved or unable to prove anything at the time. Garrett and Henderson looked into the lead. They found old records of disappearances that happened in the same way, going back to at least 1905. If the information was true, the Reverend had been doing this for at least 4 years, and maybe even longer. He had perfected his method, learned exactly how to choose victims who wouldn't be immediately sought out, how to cover his tracks, how to maintain the mask of devotion even under pressure. It was becoming clear how serious the crimes were. This was not a crime of passion, a moment of insanity, or an act of impulse. It was something that was planned, carried out with military precision over the course of years. The Reverend had turned the abuse of faith into a way to stay alive, and maybe even into something darker. A way to meet a psychological need that no one could fully understand. The Appalachian communities that used to be friendly and trusting started to change. People who had always welcomed strangers with open arms now looked at any traveler with suspicion. Churches started to check visiting preachers more carefully. Trust, the thing that held these communities together, had been brutally ripped apart. The Reverend, who was even in jail, kept hurting people, and his shadow reached far beyond the bars of his cell. As fall came, a cold wind blew down from the mountains like a warning. The leaves started to fall again, which was exactly 1 year after the Reverend started his famous trip through the Appalachians. The Pocahontas County Courthouse got ready for what would be one of the most talked-about trials in the area. There wasn't enough room for everyone to be there at the same time, so shifts were set up so that people could attend the proceedings. On the morning of October 1909, the Reverend was taken to court in chains, but he still looked strangely dignified. He was still wearing the same black suit, which was now more worn from his time in prison, but he still had the air of respectability that had been his best weapon. He looked around the crowded room, taking in each face with the same level of focus as always. There was no fear there, just curiosity, like he was studying another group of people. Henderson had carefully thought out his plan. He knew he couldn't just trust the evidence he could see. He had to put together a case based on patterns of behavior and the sum of all the coincidences that, when put together, made an undeniable picture. His first step was to put Elizabeth on the stand. The woman, who was nervous but determined, told the jury about her time with the accused. She talked about the strange questions he asked, how he acted during prayers, and how she always felt uneasy around him, even though she didn't know why. The defense lawyer tried to get his testimony thrown out by saying that feelings alone were not enough to prove a crime, but Henderson had seen this coming. He called witness after witness, and they all told stories that were very similar. A pattern started to form in the minds of the jurors. The preacher always asked specific questions about material things, always left before dawn, and always left an eerie feeling in the air. The most powerful moment was when Henderson gave the notebooks. He read certain parts out loud to show the jury how much planning had gone into the crime. Each entry gave a glimpse into the Reverend's mind, showing that he was not a man of faith but a calculating predator who used religion as a way to get to people. As the words echoed, the room became completely silent, and everyone felt the weight of that truth. The lawyer for the defense said that the notebooks only showed that his client kept detailed records of his missionary trips, which is something that many traveling preachers do. He said that the things in the briefcase could have been gifts or donations made by people who were thankful for the sermons. It wasn't a strong defense, but it was all he had because there was no direct evidence. Then Henderson changed his mind. He started to put together the full timeline, linking each disappearance to the time the Reverend was in that area. He hung big maps on the wall and marked each place and date on them. This made a visual timeline that even the most skeptical person couldn't ignore. The path through the mountains was winding, and at each marked point, a life had been cut short. Sheriff Garrett was asked to testify about the searches and the arrest. He talked about what he found in the ravine and the traces he found, but he was careful not to go into too much detail that could be seen as speculation. His voice was strong, but anyone who knew him could tell that he was feeling something behind his words. That case had a big effect on him and changed how he thought about people. During cross-examination, the defense lawyer asked Garrett a lot of questions about the lack of solid proof. Where was the proof? Where were the people who saw the crimes happen? Garrett said they didn't have any of that, but he was sure that the total of the circumstantial evidence was too clear to ignore. The Reverend had to testify in his own defense. It was the first time anyone had heard his voice in public since he was jailed. He spoke in his usual hypnotic way, denying all the charges and saying that he was the victim of a terrible injustice. He said he was just a humble servant of God who had dedicated his life to bringing spiritual comfort to Appalachian communities that were cut off from the rest of the world. People who were thankful gave him the things in his briefcase as gifts. The notes were just a record of his time as a missionary, that's all. But something interesting happened while he was on the stand. Henderson, who was good at reading people, saw something that confirmed what he thought. The Reverend talked about his faith and devotion, but his eyes told a different story. There was a glint there, a tiny hint of happiness, as if he were enjoying the show and still had control over the room. It was the look of someone who thought he was better than everyone else and saw the trial as just another game he was winning. Henderson was patient as he waited for his turn to be cross-examined. When he finally got the chance, he started with easy questions about the minister's religious background. Where did he go to school to study theology? What church had given him the authority? Who could check his credentials? The Reverend gave a vague answer, naming institutions that didn't exist and names that couldn't be checked. Every answer only confirmed what Henderson already thought. It had all been a lie from the start. Henderson changed his plans then. He started asking specific questions about Bible verses and passages that any good preacher would know by heart. The Reverend thought for a moment. His answers were less sure and more vague. He knew well-known Bible verses that anyone with a basic understanding of the Bible would know. But when he was asked about more complicated theological ideas and interpretations, it became clear that he didn't know much more than the average person. He could fool people who didn't know much about theology, but he couldn't keep up the role he had taken on. The mask was coming off, and the Reverend saw it. His face changed slightly from confident to something darker. He stopped pretending to be a preacher and for the first time showed a little bit of who he really was. When Henderson asked his last question, which was if he felt bad about the people who had gone missing, the Reverend just smiled. His smile was cold and not human, and he only said, "Remorse presupposes that something wrong was done, prosecutor, and I don't recognize that premise." There was a lot of whispering in the room. The judge had to hit his gavel a lot to get things back in order. That answer told more than any confession ever could. It showed that he not only knew what had happened, but also that he didn't think his actions were wrong at all. It was the last piece of proof that they were dealing with someone very different. Someone whose morals worked on a level that was completely different from those of normal society. The closing arguments went on for hours. Henderson went over the whole case again, tying together all the dots, testimonies, and pieces of evidence into a story that left no room for reasonable doubt. The defense said that correlation did not mean causation, and that there should be an acquittal because there was no direct evidence. But both sides knew that the jury had seen more than enough. The Reverend stayed seated and still while the jury went to talk about the case. The cold smile on his face stayed there. He had lost control of the story, but he seemed to enjoy knowing that no one would ever fully understand his real crimes. He knew the mountains would keep his secrets, and that seemed to give him some strange comfort. Outside the courthouse, the victims' families waited nervously. Some people prayed, while others just cried. Everyone knew that no matter what the jury said, the people they had lost would never come back. The trial wouldn't bring their lives back. It wouldn't fill the hole left by their disappearances. But maybe, just maybe, it would bring some kind of justice and show that the bad things that happened wouldn't be forgotten. The jury talked about the case all night and into the early hours of the morning. The courtroom was empty, but hundreds of people were still nearby, talking in small groups in low voices, sharing their thoughts, theories, and memories. Bonfires were lit in the main square, and the people of the town kept watch, as if they were guarding something that had been lost for a long time. The chilly October air was thick with tension, as if everyone knew that this moment would mean more than just a simple verdict. Henderson stayed in his temporary office, going over his notes for the 100th time. He knew he had done everything he could, but the not knowing bothered him. It was always a risk to have trials based on circumstantial evidence. They relied on the jury's capacity to discern connections and recognize patterns that others might perceive as mere coincidence. If one juror were to be skeptical, the jury could split, and that would mean starting over. Garrett stood outside, smoking his pipe and looking up at the stars through the trees. He thought about the families who had put their faith in him to find answers, like Martha and the others whose fates were still unknown. He felt a lot of pressure because he knew the truth but couldn't fully prove it. He had spent months of his life on this case, putting off other duties and investigations because he thought it was the right thing to do. The Reverend slept soundly in his cell, or at least he looked like he did. The guard who watched over him at night would later say that there were times when he was sure the prisoner was awake, with his eyes half closed and watching the shadows dance on the walls in the light of the lamp. There was no visible worry or signs of the pain that should come with waiting for a trial for such serious crimes. It was as if the result didn't really matter to him. He acted like he didn't care about anything. The hours went by very slowly. Some of the people waiting fell asleep while leaning against trees or sitting on the steps of nearby buildings, but many stayed awake, their adrenaline keeping them alert as they waited for the moment when justice would finally be served. There were reporters from faraway newspapers there, taking notes and guessing what headlines they would write based on the outcome. The courthouse bell rang 3 times at dawn, when the pale light began to turn the sky orange. This meant that the jury had made its decision. The sound echoed through the mountains, and it felt like nature itself was holding its breath. People got up quickly, shaking off the sleepiness of a night without sleep, and started to walk silently toward the courthouse in a way that felt like a ritual. The room filled up again, this time with tired and tense faces. The judge went back to his desk, and his blank face gave no hint of what was to come. The jurors lined up and didn't look at the defendant, which many people saw as a sign. Henderson and the defense attorney sat down, both tired and knowing that there was nothing else they could do but wait. They brought the Reverend in, still in chains, and for the first time since the trial started, his face looked different. It wasn't exactly fear, but maybe the realization that the game was over and there were no more moves to be made or tricks that could change the outcome. He sat still, with his hands crossed in his lap, and stared at an empty space in front of him. When asked, the jury foreman, a 60-year-old farmer with calloused hands from hard work, stood up. His voice shook a little when he started to speak, not because he was unsure, but because of how big the moment was. His peers had chosen him to say words that would echo across the mountains for many years to come. When he finally said guilty, the word echoed through the room like thunder from far away, and everyone seemed to let out a sigh at the same time. Guilty of theft, guilty of fraud, and most importantly, guilty of being involved in the disappearances, even without the physical evidence that would usually be needed. The jury had decided that the pattern was too clear, and that the circumstantial evidence added up to a strong case that left no room for doubt. They could see through the mask and knew who the predator was behind the preacher. The pastor didn't show any signs of being upset. There was no dramatic fall, and no one protested their innocence. He just kept staring at that vague point, as if the verdict were just a formality he had already expected. But those who watched him closely could see a small change in his eyes, a coldness that got even colder, if that was possible. The sentence would come later, but everyone knew what it would be: life in prison in the state penitentiary. There would be no execution because there were no bodies, which meant that a formal charge of first-degree murder could not be made. But the end result would be the same. The Reverend would spend the rest of his life in prison, away from the people he had hurt so badly.
People outside had different reactions as the news spread. There was relief, of course, and a feeling that something important had been done, but there was also a lingering sadness, a realization that justice, no matter how welcome, could not undo the harm that had been done. The victims were still missing. Their families still didn't have all the answers, and the scars on the communities would last for a long time. Henderson took a short break to feel good about himself before going back to work. He was sure the case wasn't over. There was still the problem of finding the victims and giving their families the closure they needed. He planned to step up the search in the next few days, using the conviction as a way to get the Reverend to tell him where the bodies were hidden. They had a small amount of hope, but it was all they had. Garrett, on the other hand, was torn. The win in court was important, but it didn't feel good. He had spent so much time on that case that he now felt empty, as if his work was not done. No one would ever be truly at peace as long as the mountains kept their secrets, and those people stayed missing. In the days after the verdict, newspapers all over the area wrote long articles about the case. The headlines were all over the place, from sensational to thoughtful, but they all agreed that the trial of the fake reverend meant something important. It was a dark reminder that evil could wear any mask, that trust was both a strength and a weakness, and that communities needed to be on the lookout without losing their basic humanity. On a gray November morning, the Reverend was moved to prison. He was chained inside a closed wagon and had to travel through the same mountains he had freely crossed just a year before. This time, though, there was no freedom at the end of the road. Instead, there were high walls and iron bars that would keep him from the world forever. While they were traveling, guards said he stayed completely quiet and looked out at the passing scenery through the small gaps in the cart. No one could tell if there was any thought or feeling behind that look. He had become a total mystery, a person that no one could understand. When the Reverend got to the prison, he was registered, had his black suit taken off, and was given a striped prison uniform to wear. It was the end of his identity as a preacher, the last time he took off the mask he had worn for so long. But even then, without his religious symbols, he still had that unsettling presence and unnatural calm that made even the guards feel uneasy. He was put in solitary confinement not as a punishment but as a safety measure. The police were worried that he could use his ability to manipulate other prisoners to find new victims, even while he was in jail. And maybe they were right. Even when he was alone and quiet, the Reverend seemed to have an aura of danger that stone walls couldn't hold back. Weeks turned into months, and life in the Appalachian Mountains slowly got back to normal. But it wasn't the same kind of normalcy as before. People were more careful when they talked to each other, and they didn't trust each other as much. Churches still had visiting preachers, but they were now more careful. They checked credentials and called other churches to confirm identities. A necessary but sad watchfulness had taken the place of innocence. The winter of 1910 arrived with unusual ferocity in the Appalachians, bringing blizzards that isolated entire villages and transformed the mountains into a white, impenetrable labyrinth. It was as if nature itself was sealing the secrets it had kept, covering with its icy mantle any trace that might still exist in the ravines and dense forests. Search expeditions were suspended for months, and the frustration of not being able to continue investigating weighed heavily on everyone involved in the case. In the state penitentiary, the Reverend adapted to the prison routine with the same disconcerting ease with which he had adapted to any other environment. The guards who watched over him said that he spent most of his time reading the same Bible he had asked for and writing notes in the margins with very small, neat handwriting. When people asked him what he was writing, he would only say that he was getting ready to give sermons when he got out of prison. Everyone knew that this was ridiculous because he had a life sentence, but it showed how out of touch with reality he was, or maybe it was a dark irony that only he understood. Robert Sullivan, the experienced warden of the prison, kept detailed records on all the inmates he was in charge of. But the pastor got a lot of attention. Sullivan had seen a lot of criminals in his career, from murderers who acted on impulse to thieves who made a living stealing. But he had never met anyone like this prisoner before. The way the Reverend acted was very disturbing. It was more than just being cold or cruel. It was a lack of basic humanity. Sullivan tried to figure out what drove the man during their short conversations. He asked him a lot of questions about his childhood and what made him choose to live as a traveling preacher as a cover for his crimes. The Reverend told vague and contradictory stories that changed every time they talked. He once said that he grew up on a farm in the southern United States. He also said that he grew up in a city that he never fully named. Sullivan couldn't tell what was true and what was made up, and he finally decided that maybe even the Reverend didn't know where the lie ended and the truth began. In the meantime, Henderson kept working hard to make a full map of the crimes. He had written to officials in several states to get reports of missing people who had gone missing in similar ways. What he found was even scarier than he had thought it would be. There were cases that went back to 1903, and maybe even earlier, in a geographic area that included almost all of the Appalachian region and beyond. He was interested in one case in particular. In 1904 in Tennessee, an entire family went missing after a traveling preacher came to see them. The property was empty, and there were signs that the people had left quickly, but without taking important things. Back then, the authorities thought the family had probably run away from debt, but Henderson now saw disturbing similarities between the way the Reverend worked and the way the family worked. He went there himself and talked to neighbors who still remembered the case. They all said the same thing about the visiting preacher. He wore a black suit, carried a leather briefcase, and had a voice that could put people to sleep. The investigation found something that changed Henderson's understanding of how bad the crimes were. The Reverend didn't start with people who were alone. In the beginning, he seemed to be less picky, bolder, or maybe just less experienced when it came to picking targets that wouldn't be immediately looked for. Over time, he had improved his method by learning how to pick victims who would die and live without making big waves in society. It was a troubling change that showed not only premeditation, but also a desire to keep learning and improving one's skills. Henderson put all of this information together into a long report that he sent to both state and federal authorities. He said that the case against the Reverend was unlike anything else, a type of crime that needed new ways to be investigated and recorded. He hoped that by making a full record, future investigators would be able to spot similar patterns before they did so much damage. Garrett set up a new series of search expeditions in the spring of 1910, when the snow finally melted and the trails were open again. This time, he had help from volunteers from several counties. These men knew every inch of the mountains, every hidden cave, and every deep ravine where something could have been hidden. They split the area into sections and set up a methodical search system that would eventually cover all of the land where the victims had gone missing. The searches were tiring and sometimes risky. The men had to deal with rough ground, makeshift bridges over fast-moving rivers, and thick plants that they had to clear meter by meter. There were days when they walked for 12 hours straight, and only found old hunters' camps or signs of wild animals. People were always frustrated, but Garrett kept everyone going by reminding them that they were doing something important, giving families a chance to finally find peace. In May of that year, a team found something important in a remote area close to where Martha had lived. There was proof that someone had used that space many times, hidden in a cave that had partially collapsed and was covered in years of sediment and plant growth. These weren't just occasional marks, they were signs of regular use. There were pieces of clothing, personal items that could be identified, and even more disturbing, marks on the stone walls that showed the cave had been changed on purpose, with some parts being made bigger. Garrett went to the site himself and brought a draftsman with him to write down everything. The cave's location was what impressed him the most. It was almost impossible to see from the main trail, and only people who knew exactly where to look could get to it. The rocks around it were arranged in such a way that any noise coming from inside would be completely muffled. People would only find it by accident or on purpose. The find made me wonder how many other caves like that one were hidden in the mountains. Over the years, the Reverend had traveled hundreds of kilometers. If he had set up more places like that one, it would have been almost impossible to find all the victims. The Appalachian Mountains were huge and had a lot of hidden places where evidence could stay hidden for hundreds of years. Henderson was told about the discovery right away and decided to try one last time to get information from the Reverend. He went to the prison with pictures of the place, detailed drawings, and a well-thought-out plan for how to question the person. He hoped that the Reverend would finally give in and tell him where the other victims were when he saw the hard evidence. Henderson and the prisoner were in a small room with no windows. There was only a table between them. The Reverend had been brought in with chains on his hands and feet, but he still looked strangely calm, as if he were just visiting a friend. Henderson laid the pictures out on the table and watched carefully for any changes in facial expression. For a moment, it looked like something passed through the Reverend's eyes. A flash of recognition, or maybe surprise that they had found this exact spot, but it was only for a moment. Then the usual mask of indifference came back. Henderson talked for almost an hour, going into great detail about what they had found, how the evidence linked to the disappearances, and how many families were still waiting for answers. He tried to reach the last bit of humanity that might still be in that man, saying that telling the truth could bring some kind of redemption, or at least make it easier to carry those secrets alone. The Reverend listened quietly, his fingers drumming softly on the table in an uneven pattern. When Henderson finally stopped talking, the prisoner leaned forward a little and spoke for the first time, waiting nervously for a response. His voice still had that hypnotic quality, that tone that had fooled so many people. "Prosecutor Henderson, you've been trying to understand something that you can't. The mountains have always kept their secrets, long before I got there and long after I left. What you've found is just a shadow, a piece, and even if you spent the rest of your life looking, you would never find all the answers you want. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved." It was both annoying and informative. The pastor was basically saying that there was a lot more than what they had found, but he wouldn't give them any specifics. It was his last way to stay in charge, his way of making sure that even in jail or after losing, he still had power over the story and kept secrets that would haunt the investigators for years. Henderson tried a few different things. In the next few hours, he made concessions, promised better conditions in prison, and even said he might be able to move to a less strict wing. Nothing worked. The Reverend thought that keeping his secrets to himself was more important than any help he could get in exchange for working with the police. There was something wrong with this choice. It made him feel good to know that his legacy would live on forever, even though no one would ever know what it was. Henderson felt very tired when he finally got out of prison, and it wasn't just his body. It was the tiredness of banging against a wall that couldn't be broken through and dealing with a mind that worked on logic that was completely different from his own. He had done everything he could, used every tool a prosecutor had, but he knew that thousands of questions would never be answered. The searches went on for months, but they got less and less intense. The truth was that they didn't have unlimited resources, that other cases needed their attention, and that life had to go on even though there were still mysteries to solve. Eventually, 2 more caves were found, and each one had pieces of evidence that confirmed the pattern but didn't give full answers. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle that was impossible to finish because most of the pieces were gone for good. The people of the Appalachian communities slowly changed how they thought about their own history. The case of the false reverend became part of local folklore, a story told on dark nights to remind people that not everything that seems sacred truly is. Parents warned their children about the importance of distrusting strangers, even those who came with beautiful words and spiritual promises. It was a hard lesson, but one that had to be learned. For years, journalists were still interested in the case. They wrote follow-up articles every now and then, guessing how many victims there were and trying to figure out what made the crimes happen. Some treated the subject with the seriousness it deserved, while others fell into sensationalism, turning real tragedy into morbid entertainment. Henderson detested the latter, feeling they disrespected the memory of the victims and the suffering of their families. The years dragged on with a slowness peculiar to those who had been touched by the case. The calendar moved relentlessly forward, marking seasons that came and went. But the weight of those events remained suspended in the mountain air, like a fog that never fully dissipated. In 1912, Garrett finally retired from his position as sheriff, passing the badge to a younger man who would inherit not only the responsibilities of the office, but also the unresolved legacy that would define his own career. During his final days in the office, Garrett meticulously organized all the files related to the Reverend's case. He created a detailed cataloging system, ensuring that any future investigator could quickly grasp the extent and complexity of the crimes. There were maps marked with all known locations, carefully constructed timelines, transcripts of testimonies, copies of the Reverend's notebooks. It was a haunted archive, a collection of fragments that together formed an incomplete portrait of something terrible that had traversed those lands. The new sheriff, Thomas Crawford, was impressed by how carefully the documents showed how obsessed they were. Of course, he had heard stories about the case, like everyone else in the area, but seeing the actual evidence of the investigation was different. That work was monumental. The dedication went beyond just doing what was expected of him. Garrett had made it his own personal mission, and now new people had to take on that responsibility. Henderson also started to work more slowly. Even though he never really gave up on the case, he kept in touch with officials in other states and was always on the lookout for new information that could help him understand what had happened in the past. He sometimes got letters from people who said they knew things about the Reverend, like seeing him in impossible places or coming up with complicated theories about bigger conspiracies. Most of them were just the fantasies of creative people. But he looked into each one very carefully, unable to ignore even the smallest chance of finding something new. The Reverend's life in prison was disturbingly consistent in its isolation. The years didn't seem to change him like they did other prisoners. The men around him clearly got older, broke down under the stress of being in prison, or found some kind of salvation through religion or repentance. The Reverend, on the other hand, stayed the same. He still read his Bible every day, even though the pages were so worn from being handled all the time that the words were hard to read. Some guards thought he had already memorized every verse and was just going through the motions because it was a habit, or maybe for some reason that only made sense to him. Director Sullivan started keeping a personal diary to record his observations of his most unusual prisoner, who he had gotten to know well. He didn't do it officially, but he felt like he had to write down what he saw. There was something special about this case that he thought future experts in human behavior might want to look into. His notes were clinical, but they sometimes showed how frustrated he was that he couldn't get to know this man better. One entry from 1913 that stood out described how another prisoner had been able to yell something to the Reverend through the walls that separated the isolation cells. The prisoner asked the Reverend if he was afraid of dying or of the divine judgment that was supposed to come after he died. Sullivan said that the Reverend's answer was disturbing in its simplicity. "Fear presupposes uncertainty, and I have no uncertainties about anything." This showed that he had no remorse and was completely sure of his own beliefs, no matter how wrong they might be. The Appalachian communities, on the other hand, were still slowly healing, even though scars were still visible to those who knew where to look. Churches that used to let anyone in now put up locks. Families that used to welcome strangers with open arms now asked questions, asked for references, and stayed a safe distance away until trust could be built up slowly. It was a sad but necessary change, the end of a time when things were simple and would never be the same again. Martha, the widow who was one of the first known victims, became an unintentional symbol of all the missing people. People used her name in sermons to remind people that even the most devout could be tricked, and that true faith needed more than just belief. The cabin she left behind eventually fell apart because it was overgrown with plants, but people still went there from time to time and left wildflowers or small wooden crosses as makeshift memorials.
In 1915, Henderson got an unexpected letter from a psychiatrist who worked at a faraway institution. The doctor had read about the case in academic journals and was interested in studying the Reverend as an example of what he called a personality without moral conscience. Henderson replied with cautious enthusiasm, providing a lot of information but warning that the Reverend probably wouldn't help with any study. He was right about what he said. When the psychiatrist finally went to the prison and tried to talk to the prisoner, there was complete silence. The priest wouldn't talk at all and stared at the wall as if the doctor didn't exist. The psychiatrist's report, which he eventually published, was based only on secondary documents and a few behavioral observations, but its conclusions were both interesting and troubling. He posited that the Reverend exemplified a distinct form of pathology characterized by a total absence of empathetic capacity, not eradicated by trauma, but rather never cultivated. It was like they were dealing with someone who looked human on the outside, but had a completely different way of thinking. In academic circles, the psychiatrist's ideas caused a lot of discussion. Some coworkers said that he was making a mental illness out of what was just moral evil, while others thought it was worth trying to figure out why people act that way. Henderson was interested in these debates, but he thought they were too abstract. What mattered to him wasn't the diagnostic categories, but the fact that lives had been lost and secrets were still hidden in the mountains. When new information came to light, Crawford, the new sheriff, sometimes reopened cases. A hunter found pieces of fabric in 1916 in a place that no one had looked before during the first searches. The analysis showed that the material was similar to clothing worn at the time of the disappearances, but without more information, it was impossible to say for sure which victim it belonged to. It was just another piece of a puzzle that didn't seem to be meant to be finished. The families of the victims found their own ways to deal with not having closure. Some people held private memorial services every year, praying and gathering with family on the anniversaries of their loved ones' deaths. Others tried to move on by not talking about it and building new lives on the shaky ground of unanswered questions. There was no right way to carry a weight that never really got lighter. In 1917, something surprising happened. Another prisoner who had briefly shared a wing with the Reverend before he was permanently separated said he had heard parts of confessions. The man, who was facing a long prison sentence, said that the Reverend had spoken to him in dreams, saying bits of names and places. Henderson went to see this witness in person to talk to them, but he quickly realized that the story was probably made up, a last-ditch effort to get a shorter sentence in exchange for information. Henderson was always frustrated by chasing false leads, but he felt he couldn't ignore any possibility. He had to look into every claim and every supposed revelation, because the only other option was to accept that they would never know the whole truth, and that felt like a betrayal of the victims and an abdication of responsibility that he couldn't bear. The First World War changed the area in many important ways. A lot of young men went off to fight in faraway places, and communities that had already been through a lot of loss had to deal with more. People still talked about the Reverend's case, but it didn't come up as often as it used to because of more pressing issues. It was a normal way for communities to change, but to those who were closely involved in the investigations, it seemed like a kind of forgetting that shouldn't be allowed. Sullivan stepped down from his job as warden of the penitentiary in 1919. His last official act was to put all of his records about the Reverend in order and make a separate file that listed every detail he had seen over the course of 10 years. He wrote a long letter to the person who would take over for him, warning them about the strange behavior of that prisoner and stressing the need for constant vigilance. This was not because there was a chance of escape or violence, but because it was deeply troubling to let such a person live without careful documentation. The 1920s were a time of change for the whole country. The Appalachian Mountains, which used to be very isolated, started to become more connected by better roads, telephone lines that cut through valleys, and modernization that slowly made the communities less vulnerable than they had been decades earlier. Things were changing in the outside world, but inside the prison, time seemed to have stopped. It was clear that the Reverend had aged, but it looked almost fake. His hair was white, and he was a little hunched over from age, but his eyes still had that same coldness and emptiness that so many people had tried and failed to understand. He still read the Bible every day, even though the pages were so worn from being handled so much that the words were hard to read. Some guards thought that he had already memorized every verse and was just going through the motions out of habit, or for some reason that only made sense in his twisted mind. Henderson, who is now retired and lives on a small piece of land near Greenbrier County, had a strange routine. Every morning he walked to the small wooden building in the back of his house that served as his office and spent a few hours going over the case files. It was no longer an active investigation. It was more like a sad meditation, an effort to find patterns he had missed and connections that might finally show him the whole truth. His wife was worried about his obsession, but she had learned not to get involved. He had to do it. It was a mission that went beyond retirement or common sense. Henderson learned in 1924 that the Reverend was very sick. The age and the conditions of confinement were finally getting to him. The doctors at the prison thought he might only have a few months to live, maybe even weeks. Henderson felt a new sense of urgency. If there was any chance of getting a final confession, some acknowledgement, or some information about where the victims were, it would be now, when death was so close that it could finally break the silence. He went to the prison on a cold autumn afternoon. The air was thick with the smell of rotting leaves and the promise of winter coming soon. The new warden greeted him with respect, knowing how important that moment was in history. They walked together through the dark hallways to the solitary confinement cell where the Reverend had lived for the last 15 years of his life. The prisoner was lying on a narrow bed with a thin blanket over him. It was hard for him to breathe, and it seemed like every breath took a lot of effort. When Henderson walked in, the Reverend slowly turned his head, and for a moment their eyes met. There was recognition there, a mental clarity that went against how bad his body was getting. Henderson set a chair down next to the bed and sat down. He didn't have the energy for long, complicated interrogations, or for coming up with complicated ways to get information. He spoke honestly and simply about the families who were still waiting for answers, the burden of those secrets, and the chance to do something good before it was too late. There was no accusation or judgment in his voice. It was just a simple appeal from one man to another. The priest listened without saying anything, his eyes on the dirty ceiling of the cell. Minutes went by without a response, and Henderson began to believe that this man would stay quiet even though he was about to die. But then the Reverend finally spoke, but his voice was weak and hoarse. It wasn't a full confession, and it wasn't the exact coordinates that Henderson had hoped for. The mountains know. They always have, and some secrets belong only to them. It was just one sentence, and Henderson had to lean in to hear it. That was all he would get. The Reverend closed his eyes and said nothing more, no matter how much Henderson insisted. A few weeks later, on a gray November morning in 1924, the Reverend died in his sleep. There were no dramatic last words, no deathbed revelation. He simply ceased to exist, taking with him all the details he had so zealously guarded for decades. People in the communities that had been hurt by his crimes had different reactions to the news of his death. Some people felt better, as if an evil force had finally been removed from the world. Others were only sad again because they knew they would never find the answers they were looking for. There was no funeral, no sermon, no ceremony. His body was buried in a mass grave in the prison cemetery without a headstone, without any marking to indicate who was there. It was the final anonymity for someone who had used so many false identities in life. Henderson lived a few more years, passing away peacefully in 1929. His files on the case were donated to the county library, where they remained as a silent testament to events that had shaped a generation. Garrett had already passed away years before, taking with him memories of paths traveled in search of truths that always seemed to be just beyond reach. The following decades brought continuous changes to Appalachia. Communities grew, technology advanced, and new generations were born without direct knowledge of the events that had haunted their grandparents. The story of the false Reverend became something somewhat forgotten, mentioned occasionally in conversations about the past, but no longer carrying the immediate emotional weight it once had. Still, something remained. On silent nights when the mist descended upon the valleys and the mountains became silhouetted shadows against the dark sky, there were those who still thought about those dark times. The discovered caves remained sealed, marked only by records in dusty archives. The others, those that were never found, remain hidden somewhere in the endless folds of those ancient mountains. History reminds us that not everything is as it seems, that trust is a precious thing that must be given with care, and that some questions may never have complete answers. The mountains still hold their secrets today, silent witnesses to events that defied comprehension, and perhaps they continue to guard mysteries that will never be fully revealed.